Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Kyle Marquardt, and I am a professor at the Department of Comparative Politics here at UIB. And it is my distinct privilege and pleasure to introduce Professor Eugene Finkel of Johns Hopkins University SAIS. Eugene is the Kenneth H. Keller Professor of International Affairs at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Since completing his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2012, he has published 4 books, including the one that he is presenting today. He is a foremost expert on genocide studies, Russian politics, Ukrainian politics, and has also done a lot of work recently on Israeli politics and the Holocaust. We are really, really lucky to have Professor Finkel here to give us a lot of context on the current Russian-Ukrainian conflict, and specifically the full-scale invasion of Ukraine that started in 2022. So, Professor Finkel, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Kyle, and thank you for organizing this and hosting me, and thank you all for coming that early in the morning. I really appreciate it. So, my talk today is based on my book, which was published last year with Basic Books. So, if you like the talk, then please buy the book. They're out there. I will be more than happy to sign. Even if you don't like the talk, I still hope you buy the book. At best, it will convince you that I'm right despite the talk. At worst, you will have even more things to hate about it. So that's the book. Here on the left is the European/UK edition. That's the US one. You decide which one is more macabre. But I think they both convey, the main message or the main things that I wanted to understand in this book. It's not an academic manuscript as such, it's more for general public and also for myself trying to understand what's going on. The working title, as I was writing it, was To Kill Ukraine, but eventually the editor decided that it's a bit over the top and sounds too much like a do-it-yourself manual, so we switched to Intent to Destroy, which also conveys, the questions that I'm trying to grapple with. And that's mainly the Russian violence against civilians in Ukraine since the start of the full-scale invasion in 2022. Because if you follow the news from Ukraine, you obviously know that violence against civilians is one of the key features of this war. The obliteration of entire cities like Mariupol, mass executions such as Bucha, torture, rape, sexual violence, and more gruesome stuff such as beheading, castrating, live POWs with box cutters, etc., etc., etc. But at the same time, if you look at the Russian propaganda or the Russian official message, especially at the early stages of the war, they would present this as a war of liberation. The war to protect the long-suffering, oppressed Ukrainian Russian speakers who are being mistreated by the neo-Nazi government in Kiev. And both things cannot be true at the same time. I'm not an historian, I'm a political scientist, but I still know enough about history of wars to tell you that genuine liberation does not involve mass execution and castration of people you are claiming to be liberating. So those messages together did not make sense, and that's a kind of puzzle that I set out to explain in this book, first to myself and then to others as well. But as I started reading and writing more, I quickly figured out that I cannot explain what's going on the ground in Ukraine by starting with February 2022 and not even 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea and Russian citizens with very close ties to the Russian security services started the war in the Donbass. I had to go back in time until it became a historical narrative that covers the last 200 years. I do about the current war in the book, of course, but the focus switched from trying to explain the violence on the ground since February 22 to a broader story of Russian obsession with Ukraine and Russian policies towards Ukraine and attempts to dominate Ukraine over the last 200 years, and the Russian violence against Ukraine, both the country and the people, not just ethnic Ukrainians, but also minorities. Minorities play a huge and very crucial role in this story when the Russian government, and here I'm using Imperial Russian, Soviet, and post-Soviet Russian governments interchangeably, their violence against civilians when they can't achieve this dominance peacefully. But, since we're at the university and I'm a professor, then let's start with a quiz. So here are 3 quotes. How many of them you think belong to Putin? And if not all 3, then how many and which ones? Come on, 1, 2, 3. Guesses? 3, 1. I saw you reading the book, so it's easy. Yeah. So 3, come on. 3, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 3. Yeah, so usually when I give this quiz, it's somewhere between 2 and 3, actually just 1. Just the first one. The first one is Putin from his July 2021 article on the historical unity of Russian and Ukrainian people. But the other 2 are also real. So what are they? The second one is Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, the commander-in-chief of the Russian army during World War I in 1914, just before the Russian army invaded Austro-Hungary, and more specifically Galicia and Bukovina, which are now Western Ukraine. The third quote is Vyacheslav Molotov of the Molotov-Ribbentrop fame, Stalin's Minister of Foreign Affairs, justifying the Soviet invasion of Poland on September 17, 1939, when Hitler and Stalin decided to carve up Poland. But unless you really know history down to knowing the quotes, it's really hard to tell, whether Putin actually said it, because he could have said all those 3 things, and all those messages and quotes are pretty similar. So another thing that I'm trying to understand is, well, where exactly do those consistencies come from, what drives them, and more importantly, how those ideas translate into action. So my argument in a very brief nutshell, that over the last 200 years, controlling and dominating Ukraine, or what can be quite reasonably described as an obsession with Ukraine, is driven by 2 things: identity and security. There is a huge debate, in academia, among policymakers, think tankers, journalists in the West. Well, what drives the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022? Is it about identity, imperial ideology, Russian nationalism, or is it just about security, fear of NATO, etc., etc.? Well, in fact, it's both. It's not one or the other. Both are present, though at different points in time. The importance of identity versus security would change, but over the last 200 years, both identity and security play an important role in explaining Russian and Soviet policies towards Ukraine. Now, I will start with identity, because identity is, in my view, a much more important part of the story. So, and this identity argument is based on 3 prongs. The first is that both Russia and Ukraine trace their history to Kievan Rus, a medieval Slavic state established by people from somewhere around here, or in other words, Vikings, that was pretty successful, pretty large, encompassed most of contemporary Ukraine, Belarus, Western Russia, and then got destroyed in the 13th century by Mongol invasion. And once the Kievan Rus was destroyed, areas which are now Ukraine went very quickly to Poland and Lithuania, but the eastern part came under the Mongol rule, and out of Mongol rule, Moscow emerged after several hundred years from a tiny, very insignificant place as a very successful, very ambitious, extremely dynamic imperial power that also believed that it is an heir to Kiev and has a natural right to control all those lands that belong to the Kievan Rus. Now, many states have those origin stories that trace their history back to some distant land or state that got destroyed. The problem is that Kievan Rus is not just some mythical state. Kiev is also a capital of a different country that many Russians believe they have a natural right to govern. A second prong is the idea that Russian people actually consist of 3 branches. The Great Russians, or Russians without adjectives, the Little Russians, who are Ukrainians, and the White Russian, Belarusians. Great and Little Russians originally started simply as geographic terms. But once you start using the terminology of great and little, it has to evolve into hierarchical relationship, and that's exactly what happened in the relations between Russians and Ukrainians. So a lot of the Russian reactions to what Ukrainian does when they tries to chart its own policy can be simply boiled down to how dare you, who you think you are, doing something without asking our permission first. After all, we are the great Russians, you are the little ones, you should obey us, we are the big brother, or the elder brother. And the third component is that all those three branches have only one language for literature, science, administration, and that's, of course, Russian. Ukrainian and Belarusian are just peasant dialects, so using them for literature, poetry, science is simply a waste of time and resources. If you want to do those advanced things, you should do them all in Russian, and using Ukrainian for those purposes is simply a waste of time and resources. Now, most people who know anything about Russia and Ukraine are, of course, well familiar with those three components. What most people do not realize is how recent they are. And that's where the security part starts kicking in. Those ideas did not spring out of nowhere hundreds and hundreds of years ago. They're mostly a product of the first half of the 19th century, and more specifically the fight between the Russian Empire and the Polish independence movement. Because when Russian Empire, Prussia, and Austria partitioned Poland out of existence, most parts that are now Ukraine went to the Russian Empire, and with them also came the Polish nobility that dominated those regions, and the urban middle classes, which were predominantly Polish. And those people fought throughout the 19th century, sometimes very bloodily, to regain the independence of Poland, and with the independence of Poland, also the territories which are now Ukraine. The Russian Empire had to deal with pretty large, pretty bloody Polish uprisings in 1830s and 1860s, and the response of the government in St. Petersburg was that if the trend continues, all those Polish elites, Polish nobility will corrupt, quote unquote, those Orthodox peasants, those little Russians, turn them into Poles, teach them to speak Polish, and they will be lost to the empire, and that cannot be allowed to happen. So since 1830s, the imperial government starts a campaign of emphasizing how Russian, in this case Little Russian, the region is, and in 1860s it switches to a campaign of forced Russification. The Ukrainian language is banned, you cannot publish pretty much anything in Ukrainian, the curriculum switches to emphasizing that this region is Russian, 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 without adjectives, but even more importantly, but that's not the only security component of this story. There is also the national security, right? The natural borders between Ukraine and the rest of Europe, the Carpathian Mountains, the Pripyat marshes. But once you penetrate those, the road to Moscow is pretty much open. It's an open steppe. And historically, most of the Western invasions of Russia came through Ukraine, so the government is traditionally quite concerned about Ukraine from a national security perspective. But even more importantly than national security is the regime security component. Because nothing scares an autocrat in Moscow more than a democratic, free Ukraine, because if those are the same people, and if Ukrainians manage to build a democracy, then, God forbid, Russians might want to have the same and might be able to do the same. In a sense, it's a catch-22, it's a self-imposed situation. You can get quite easily out of it by saying that actually Russians and Ukrainians are different people with different histories and different ways of doing things and organizing, but that would undermine the identity component of the regime. So they're stuck in this contradiction, and for the government, the only way to deal with this contradiction, to protect autocracy in Moscow and St. Petersburg, by making sure that there is no democracy in Ukraine. Because democratic and revolutionary ideas also tend to come to Moscow and St. Petersburg from and to Ukraine. And the final point that I want to make is that violence and repression would be used as and if needed, but violence and repression are costly. So while the Russian government or the Soviet governments would love and would try to control and dominate Ukraine, they would rather do it on the cheap, with as little resources, expanding as few resources as possible. And for that, they quite successfully leveraged Ukraine's internal diversity. Ukraine historically is an extremely diverse place. When I started writing just the list of main ethnic groups that called Ukraine home in the 19th century, the list lasts to about 4 lines of text. Now this diversity is not entirely gone, but has been largely diminished as a result of World War II and Stalin's repression, but it's still there. So the imperial policy was to use the divide and repress strategy. Groups that are considered as threatening for the regime would be repressed mercilessly, but at the same time there would be other groups in Ukraine that would be protected, elevated over others, and used as local agents for the government, providing manpower, local knowledge, legitimacy, essentially being the Moscow's or the St. Petersburg representatives on the ground. And over time, those groups that would provide, or that would be regime's agents, would change. Sometimes it could be Ukrainian traditional elites, like the Cossack nobility. Sometimes it could be the urban working classes. Sometimes it could be Russian speakers. At other times, minorities such as Jews. The point is that at every given point of time, there would be groups in Ukraine that would be protected, that would be elevated over others, and would be pretty happy with being governed from Moscow and St. Petersburg. And what, in my view, explains the invasion in 2022 is that for the first time in history, this divide and repress strategy failed. It failed in part as a result to the Ukrainian reaction to the 2014 and the annexation of Crimea, when many people, especially those who were traditionally more sympathetic towards Russia, were really offended by the annexation, by the Russian behavior, and especially the blatant lies coming out of Moscow, in part just a result of inertia. Right? Ukraine is an independent state since 1991, so the younger generations, those who are now fighting for Ukraine, they do not know any other country. I mean, Zelensky and I were born in the same year. We were 14 when the Soviet Union collapsed. Our generation has absolutely no nostalgia for what Soviet Union was. And the generations who came after this one, they just don't know any other state beyond Ukraine, and they feel no affinity towards Russia. Now, I'm not claiming that suddenly since 2014, all Ukrainians became liberals, or that all cleavages ceased, all cleavages, regional, religious, ethnic, suddenly ceased to exist, or then there is no far right in Ukraine. Of course, those cleavages exist, and of course, there are still people in Ukraine who love Putin. But the point is that right now, since 2014, for the first time, those cleavages are less important than your commitment to independent Ukraine. Had Putin been able to control Ukraine through proxies and turn it into Belarus light, or promote local allies such as Yanukovych, he would not have needed to invade. But now this strategy was simply not feasible, and therefore Russia switched to using force and a military invasion. And I think, this failure of divide and repress strategy also explains the violence against civilians. Here I'm taking a bit of a leap of faith because we still don't have systematic data, but what we do have, what we do know, I think, is still enough. And my argument is that since those identity views were so ingrained in the brains and the minds of soldiers who went to fight in Ukraine, they really did expect to be treated as liberators, and they really did believe that Ukrainians are brothers who will welcome them. But once, instead of welcoming ceremonies, they got resistance and bullets instead of flowers, the perception of Ukrainians switched to not to enemies. You can deal with enemies, but worse than enemies, traitors. And the violence against civilians that we see in places like Bucha is a revenge for what Russians perceive as a betrayal. Now, how do all those things that I outlined work in practice? Well, in the book, I go over several episodes throughout the 19th and 20th century. Today, I want to talk about one which is extremely interesting, but is barely known, and not even in Ukraine. Right now it's changing, but Very few people in Ukraine actually know this story, and that's the occupation of Galicia and Bukovina, what is now Western Ukraine, during World War I. So what is the story there? Well, the story there is that when Russia, Prussia, and Austria partitioned Poland, Western Ukraine, so those regions here were the only parts, the only territories that were predominantly Ukrainian and part of the Kievan Rus, which were not governed by Russia. And while in the Russian Empire, Ukrainian language and identity were suppressed, Austro-Hungary was governed differently, and their guiding principle was ethnic tolerance. So Ukrainians in those regions could have their political parties, their educational system, their clubs, their newspapers. There were Ukrainian history and Ukrainian language classes taught at the University of Lviv. There was a plan to establish an entire Ukrainian language university in Lviv that came to nothing because of the war. And it also meant that all those books that were banned in Russia were published in Austrian Ukraine and smuggled into Russia. And Ukrainian political activists who faced jail and exile in Russia would move to Galicia and start working there. And the government in St. Petersburg perceived it as a mortal danger. Why? Well, because in the 20th century, the politics in the Russian Empire changed from absolute monarchy and the divine right of kings to mass politics, elections, parliaments, and the government knew the math. And the math was quite devastating. If those people in the Russian Ukraine are little Russians, then Russians, great, little, white, together about 66-65% of the empire, a solid majority. If those people are not little Russians, but something else, then the percentage of Russians in their own state goes down to about 44-45. In other words, they become a minority. And that for the government was a mortal threat. How did they try to fight this threat? Well, first they started promoting and finding local pro-Russian activists in Austria and Galicia. And even back then it was fascinating to read people in 1910, 1911 screaming from the rooftops, it's dangerous. Now they're finding them, now they're promoting them, but then when they need, they will say that those people are oppressed and they will invade to protect, under the pretext of protecting those people, which of course exactly what Russia did in 2014 in 2022. Another policy was to present Ukraine in Russian official propaganda as some kind of artificial project, as a Western conspiracy theory to harm Russia. According to the story, there were literally people in the Austrian Army's general staff in Vienna working day and night creating the Ukrainian. That was their official job. And that is this, and obviously funded by the Jews, because you cannot escape the Jews in this story. And that is also exactly what the Russian propaganda is saying right now about Ukraine being an artificial state, an anti-Russia Western conspiracy. The only thing that changed is that now, instead of Germans and the Austrians, those are the Poles, the Brits, and the Americans doing it. But the basic logic, the basic argument is the same. The war starts in summer 1914. It goes badly for Austro-Hungary, and in September 1914, most of Galicia and Bukovina are occupied by Russia. From the Russian perspective, it's a war to liberate those Russians who are suffering in Austro-Hungary. Of course, no one asks those people whether they want to be liberated and consider themselves Russians. Spoiler alert, they did not. They were extremely loyal to the Austro-Hungarian monarchy because they knew what happens to Ukrainians in the Russian Empire. But from the Russian perspective, if those people are Russians, then nothing else matters, and they need to be liberated whether they want it or not. I already showed you the quote from Grand Duke Nicholas. The Tsar Nicholas II was talking quite openly about Russia, great Russia to the Carpathian Mountains. There is no Galicia. It's all Russian land. And the plan is very explicitly to annex those territories, those regions to the Russian Empire. Immediately after some consultations with international lawyers, they decided it cannot be done during the war. They will have to wait for peace agreements, but at least they will govern those places as if they are Russia, if not de jure, then de facto. what being governed as being part of Russia meant in those areas. Well, first it meant a huge wave of violence against civilians, mostly but not only against the Jews. Second, it meant plunder and stealing pretty much everything that could be stolen. Everything goes. My favorite and the most bizarre story that I saw is here in Chernovtsi, which is the capital of Bukovina, where the Russian cavalry unit destroyed the specimen collection in the university zoology department. The Cossacks simply broke the jars in which the specimens were preserved and drank the alcohol. But what else it means? It means targeted repression of everything and everyone who is associated with Ukrainian identity, so teachers, political activists, politicians, religious leaders, writers. They're arrested, either taken as hostages or exiled into the Russian Empire, and instead the Russian government start bringing over people, bureaucrats, to govern the region from Russia proper, according to the Russian law, in the Russian language. The language of administration changes from German and Polish to Russian, even though almost no one in the region speaks Russian. The street signs change from Latin alphabet to Cyrillic, even though most people in the region do not speak Cyrillic. They start changing the name of streets to those of Russian leaders and heroes. They even change the time zone to that of St. Petersburg. They also banned the Ukrainian language. Nothing can be published in Ukrainian, not even calendars of fairy tales. You can't even send mail in Ukrainian because postal senders are instructed to destroy all correspondence in Ukrainian. German, the language of the enemy, is fine. French, Polish, Czech, Romanian, you name it. Only two languages are banned, Ukrainian and Yiddish. They change the educational system because if this region has to become Russia, then those people need to be taught that they're Russian. Polish and German language schools are shut down but then allowed to reopen. Ukrainian language schools are shut down and eventually allowed to reopen only at the elementary level. Beyond elementary level, teachers are forced to switch to Russian, a language that they don't know, and teach according to the Russian curriculum. And they also start importing teachers from Russia proper to teach Ukrainian children that they're Russians in Russian according to the Russian curriculum. And there is a campaign to force people in the region, not in Bukovina. In Bukovina, they're mostly Orthodox, but in Galicia, where the most Ukrainians are Greek Catholic, to convert by force to Orthodox Christianity, because you cannot be a real Russian without being an Orthodox. Now, and it's not just the nationalists or the monarchists doing this. Everyone is on board. There is a consensus within Russia. The Constitutional Democrats, who are the main liberal party, is also fully supportive of all those policies. From the Russian perspective, this region is Russian and needs to be governed as it is Russia by doing all those things. Now, this occupation continued for about a year. Both Russian and Austro-Hungarian Empire collapses, and many other horrible things happened to civilians during World War I. So this story is mostly unknown, but if you look at what the Russian government is now doing in the occupied territories and eastern and southern Ukraine, it would be identical almost to the T. And for me, writing it in summer 2023 was a bit of a surreal experience, somewhat schizophrenic. I would read history in the morning with all those things, and then in the afternoon I would open the news and see the Russian government, completely different government 100 plus years later, doing exactly the same things. In Ukraine, you could change the date and the place, but the content would be identical with two exceptions. No anti-Jewish pogroms, because there are simply no Jews, and no large-scale conversion campaign as it used to be in Galicia, though there is still very violent pressure on Protestant groups in eastern and southern Ukraine and Orthodox churches who belong to the Kiev Patriarchate Patriarchate, forcing them to switch to the Moscow Patriarchate instead. But other than that, it's almost identical policies. Now, I'm not saying that somehow, Kremlin is taking out of retirement policies that they tried 100 years before in Galicia and Bukovina. In fact, I'm pretty certain that when they started those things, nobody in the Kremlin knew in the slightest what the Russian Empire did 100 years before in Galicia and Bukovina. But my point is different. My point is that simply because the goals, the perceptions, and the ideas are the same, they lead to very similar policies across almost a century. However, I also don't want to say that, that the story is deterministic and the obsession with Ukraine is a destiny. No, Russian obsession with Ukraine is a choice, not a destiny, and there were times in which Russian politicians made different choices. Those periods were short, they failed, but if we want to look forward and try to figure out how we can fix that, we need to look at those periods and see what went wrong when Russian authorities tried to win themselves of this obsession with Ukraine and eventually failed. And for me, the most important of those periods is Yeltsin's Russia and the 1990s. So I will how much time do I have? 10 minutes?
Right, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I will briefly talk about this period. 1991, 1992, Soviet Union collapses, and Russia and Ukraine go in different directions, become independent states. We know that for the majority of the Russian population at that time, they do not perceive Ukraine as a real state. Many want at least parts of Ukraine back under Russian control, but the public is also too busy surviving the economic crisis. It's not very high on their agenda. We also know that unlike Putin and many other leaders, Yeltsin, he can and should be criticized for many things, but at least on the issue of Ukraine, he instinctively understood that for Russia to overcome its imperial and Soviet legacies and become a normal state, Ukraine has to be independent. He never threatened Ukraine's independence. He was not above, threatening Ukraine or pushing Ukraine when needed, but he never questioned Ukraine's right to be an independent state. And people around him, the government, the Russian liberals, they also wanted to build Russia, which is democratic, prosperous, liberal, and not a threat to itself and its neighbors. So there was a window of opportunity to do something different between Russia and Ukraine within Russia. Then the question is what exactly those liberals did to win Russia off Ukraine. And the answer is nothing. Why? And again, it's easy to criticize with hindsight, but they simply did not think about those issues. They were mostly economists. They were thinking about market reforms, about prosperity, about how to fix the economy, and their thinking was very simple. Fix the economy, bring prosperity, all the other good things will follow. The only way to make liberal, prosperous, peaceful Russia is through fixing the economy. So their heart was in the right place. The policies that they chose were simply not appropriate. Why? Because what they did not anticipate is that if and when economic reforms fail, there will be no reason for the average Russian to support their vision of liberalism, democracy, and prosperity, and that's exactly what happened. And that was very different from economic reformers in places like Poland and Czech Republic, for instance, where they linked economic reform and the pain they brought to issues of identity, becoming independent, returning to history, returning to Europe. Russian liberals did none of that. On the other hand, the anti-Yeltsin opposition, the so-called red-brown coalition for the red of the communists and the brown of the fascists, they were out of economic decision-making. Identity was pretty much the only thing they were talking about. For the communists, they wanted to recreate the Soviet Union, and for that, Ukraine needed to be brought back. The Soviet Union collapsed because Ukraine voted for independence, and they explicitly did not want to recreate the Soviet Union with all the stunts, as they called them, or the Caucasus. They needed Ukraine. The conservatives, here the two emblematic figures are Solzhenitsyn and Lushkov. So the Nobel Prize winner writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he is venerated in the West for opposing communism. He did oppose communism, of course, but he was also a pretty radical Russian nationalist. He believed that Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus should be together as one state, and if Ukrainians are crazy enough to have independence, let them do it, but only, quote unquote, in true ethnographic borders, meaning that southern and eastern Ukraine should go to Moscow because it's actually a Russian, not Ukrainian land. He was also one of the very few people who spoke seriously since late 1980s about the possibility of a war between Russia and Ukraine and was not taken seriously. Yuri Lushkov, the mayor of Moscow, probably the second most powerful politician in the country, got himself declared persona non grata in Ukraine for going to Crimea and saying that Crimea should be Russian. He also tried to build a bridge that would connect mainland Russia to Crimea without even consulting the government in Kiev. Obviously, when the government got wind of this, they shut down the project, but this bridge was pretty much the first thing that Putin built when Russia annexed Crimea. And the radicals, Limonov, the National Bolshevik, and Alexander Dugin, the geopolitics guru, they envisioned Russia being a continental empire, and to build a continental empire, you need to start with Ukraine. It's easy to dismiss those people as crazy crackpots. It's much harder to do it with Dugin now when he's interviewed by Fareed Zakaria on CNN Live. Some people present him as Putin's brain. He, of course, not Putin's brain, but he is hugely influential, and whatever he said 20 years ago and was laughed out of the room for saying this as doing something crazy, now Putin repeats it almost verbatim. The stuff that he writes is also required reading in the Academy of the Russian General Staff. So all those people disagreed on pretty much everything beyond two things. They hated democracy, and they believed that Russia should control Ukraine. And when economic reform failed, and the vision of liberal, peaceful Russia simply went off the table, then that was the only identity, the only vision of future Russia that remained viable for most Russians, to the extent that even the liberals started adopting this language. Boris Chubais, essentially the mastermind behind Yeltsin's economic reform, started talking about Russia as a liberal empire. I personally have no idea what a liberal empire is. I ask all my friends in the UK, maybe they know, because they have more experience. Apparently they don't know either. And 2 more minutes, okay? And some even abandoned the language of liberalism altogether. So we know that in 2006, in 2007, 2008, people in the Kremlin were obsessively reading a futuristic novel. It hasn't been translated to English for a good reason. It's a horrible, boring book. But let me show you the title. So the title is The Third Empire, Russia, that it is ought to be. The author, interestingly, is a quite prominent liberal politician. He was the vice speaker of the Russian parliament from a liberal Yabloko party. So let me explain the setup. The year is 2050, so about 25 years from now. The world is divided into 5 states. Here is the Russian Empire. Obviously, it's an autocracy. Here you are, by the way, and here is Greenland. How Russia becomes this continental empire? Well, it's easy. It defeats the US in a nuclear war with some secret superweapon. But what is more interesting for me is how Russian imperial expansion begins. And it begins, obviously, with Ukraine, a country that, according to the book, and I love this quote, irritated the Kremlin by the very fact of its existence. So let me explain this scenario. It's 2007. There is a crisis in Kiev. The country is divided between the pro-Western part, who are in the government, and the pro-Russian eastern part. There are protests in eastern and southern Ukraine. They escalate. And when the government in Kiev moves in to crack down on those protests, the leaders of the protesters turn to the Kremlin and ask for help. The Kremlin intervenes. Maybe Kremlin was even behind those protests to begin with. We have no idea, wink, wink. But the Kremlin sends in the troops, defeats the Ukrainian military, warns the US to stay out of the conflict by threatening a nuclear war. Once the Ukrainian army is defeated, there is a referendum in those regions. There is a new state called Novorossiya, which is quickly annexed by Russia. And then a couple of years later, the rest of Ukraine follows. Now, if you know anything about 2014 and 2020-22, that's exactly how the story unfolded. And I know quite a few people who genuinely believe that when all those people in the Kremlin read this horrible futuristic novel, they didn't read it as a futuristic novel, they read it as a to-do manual about how to proceed with Ukraine. I wouldn't go that far, simply because we don't know. But again, for me, it's another example how same ideas, same perceptions, same goals eventually produce similar policies over time. So I will stop here. Thank you. Oh, okay.
So thank you very much, Professor Finkel. Please have a seat. And now we have some time for question and answers. And just to get the ball rolling, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the title of your book, Intent to Destroy, which comes from the definition of genocide. And if I recall correctly, you were one of the first scholars, prominent scholars, to write on Twitter that the full-scale invasion constituted a genocide. And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit of your reasoning behind that declaration and how your sort of thoughts have changed, if they have.
Absolutely, yes. So it definitely does come from the legal definition of genocide, from the Genocide Convention, that genocide acts taken with the intent to destroy a national, racial, religious, or ethnical group as such in whole in part. And you're also right that I was probably the first person to say that the Russian policy is not Mariupol, but violence behind the front lines does fit the Genocide Convention, because the definition of genocide is not about numbers. And that's a common misperception. It's about intent to destroy a group as such. And that's, I think, what we see in Ukraine. But Ukraine is also unique in a sense because historically the targeted groups are ethnic, racial, or religious. I think here it's probably the first time in my view where we see an attempt to destroy a group not based on ethnicity. It doesn't really matter whether you are Ukrainian or Russian ethnically or your religion, but to destroy a national group, which is Ukrainians as a national identity group. And we know that it's a pretty consistent, pretty widespread, and pretty elaborate policy to target people, not because of the language they speak or not because of their identity or religion, but because of any association with Ukrainian national identity. We know who was on the kill lists that the FSB officers came in. We know who is being tortured and killed and why. We know what Russians do in changing the curriculum, banning books, destroying museums, re-educating people. And they're also quite open about it. They say openly that the goal is to destroy Ukrainians as a national group, not an ethnic or religious one.
Thank you. I think we have time now for some questions from the audience.
So, please.
Yeah, I feel like there's multiple levels of okay, so the thing is, like, most Westerners don't understand Russian, and Russia itself is not a free country. So there's multiple levels of, I guess, sources of misinformation. So we don't have open access to the opinions of most Russians, and we don't have that ability in the first place because we don't understand their language. So we can't really parse out, how representative the official state Russian stance on the war is, and how that contrasts with the opinions of the average person. So is there anything we can do to make better sense of the situation?
So you're absolutely right. Doing public opinion polling in Russia is extremely hard. Although Professor Marquardt is an expert on doing that. Why? But I think we still know enough, to try to have a general sense of what's going on. So not at the level of percentages, absolutely. Certainly not for me. But we do have general ideas. We have the public opinion polling from better times where it was possible, and there were many polls that ask Russians in much better times what they think about Ukraine, or whether they perceive Ukraine as a real country, or what they think about Russians and Ukrainians, and it's very, whether Russia should annex Crimea even before 2014 or Eastern Ukraine, it's very consistent. Right now it's much harder, so I tried in this book, and I'm a native Russian speaker, so for me it's not really a problem. I did try to use other sources. So for instance, we have mountains of intercepted calls. Yes, they are not random, but they do give you a sense of what Russian soldiers on the ground think and what they talk about, where they know that they are not being recorded, and they talk to their families. Another wonderful source that they used is a Ukrainian project called Nestiny Dokazy, wall evidence, where they collect all the graffitis left by Russian soldiers in occupied territories, where they're on their own and free to write on those walls whatever they want, and you can get a sense of what they think by the messages or by what they write. So you're absolutely right. It's hard to understand public opinion during wartime in an extremely repressive regime such as 2025 Russia, but I think it's still possible to get general sense of the mood. And I think that this general mood is quite consistent with all those historical myths that Russian state worked very hard to create and perpetuate over decades.
Thank you, Professor Finkel. I'm Martin Paulsen from the Department of Foreign Languages here at UIB. Very nice presentation. I think you did a good job in kind of pointing out the highlights of the arguments. So two questions. One question is about one thing that I didn't get from your talk, but which has been a part of the larger debate about Ukraine after your book was published. So the resources question. And if you look at Ukraine in European history, Ukraine has for a long time been presented as the breadbasket of Europe. We've seen through the history of Russian-Ukrainian relations that the question of resources taken from Ukraine to the Imperial center has been a large question. And what we saw immediately after the 2022 full-scale invasion was the question of grain theft and grain exports from Russia to the rest of the world, grain that they had taken from Ukrainian territory. And now we see that from the other side of the ocean, from the US side, we see that President Trump is very interested in the resources that Ukraine have. So my question to you would be, where do the resources fit in your analysis of Russians' relationship to Ukraine and the reason why they wanted to invade Ukraine? That's one thing. The other thing is, I think, and it goes back to the title. So what I took from your presentation was that the brutality of the way that Russian soldiers approach Ukrainians could be understood as a result of the soldiers seeing Ukrainians as traitors to the common cause of being one nation. What I don't quite understand from that explanation is the connection with the title, because what I take from your title is that intent was there to begin with. So the intent to destroy was there as a part of a strategic or even tactical approach from the Russian authorities, the leadership. So if the way I understood you, it comes more down to the individual soldier. So I was interested in whether I misunderstood your argument. Thank you.
So the resources, it's a bit funny because I'm one of the few people who actually take Russian grain seriously among my colleagues. The book that I published before this one in 2023, co-authored with two other scholars, the title is Bread and Autocracy, Food Security and Politics in Putin's Russia, where we do look at the political role of grain in Putin's Russia. Historically, the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire were absolutely dependent on Ukrainian grain, not anymore. Russia is right now the largest grain exporter in the world. It controls about 25% of the global wheat market that most people do not understand. It's an extremely powerful position. If they want to starve pretty much everyone else, they can. They don't need Ukrainian grain for that. At the same time, they do use it opportunistically. Yes, you're right, they steal quite a lot of grain. The invasion destroyed Ukraine as a major exporting power and elevated Russia even more, especially in the Middle East and Africa. The agricultural producers moved in. You know, about 20% of Ukrainian cropland is now under Russian occupation. It's a black hole. What is produced there does not appear in any official statistics. It's somewhere going to Africa or the Middle East to support, Putin's friends. But that was not the goal. The goal was purely political and ideological. And after that, the producers and all the opportunists also happened to have very close ties to the regime, moved in and started using it. The same for the other side. I mean, I have no idea what's going on, in Trump's or J.D. Vance's head when they talk about rare earth minerals and resources. But if you look at the let's leave it aside. But from the Putin's perspective, if you look at the entire discourse, it's not about resources. It's mostly about ideology, a bit about security. Resources is an afterthought. For your second question about the intent to destroy, so actually I do not think that the war started as genocidal. I think that the war started with a clear attempt for regime change and turn Ukraine into something similar to Belarus. Yes, destroy this relatively small group of top elites, believing that they're the ones responsible for making Ukrainians non-Russians and be done with it. But once that failed, then the violence expanded beyond this point, and it did turn into genocidal. And we have two processes. One is at the top, where we see a shift in rhetoric and goals of the war, and one that you noticed at the bottom up, so individual soldiers. And eventually, in places like Bucha, for instance, they started converging. So I do not think that it was pre-planned. I think that had Russia won, violence against civilians would have been much more limited. The elites would have been probably killed or exiled or put in jail, but we would not have seen places like Bucha. So it's hard to do justice to all this complex story in one presentation, but it's both bottom-up and top-down processes that eventually do converge on this intent to destroy them. Since you already bought the book, it's I think chapter 10 and 11, where I talk about it more seriously.
Yeah, thank you so much for an interesting lecture. I have a question, because you said that Russia has taken measures to prevent democracy from unfolding in Ukraine. I just wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more of why this is so important to Russia. And also, do you have any examples, besides from using weapons, where Russia has tried to prevent democracy from unfolding in Ukraine? Thank you.
Absolutely. There were Russia, for Putin and people around him, democratic Ukraine is a horrible thing because, again, those are the same people. Those are Russians. There is no difference between Russians and Ukrainians. And I think most of them genuinely believe it. And it can serve as an example. In fact, we do see it being used as an example when Russian opposition started talking about Maidan in Moscow, for instance. And the government's response is anti-Maidan. For instance, how you do it? You do it through funding and promoting local politicians who are both pro-Russian and also not very keen on democracy, such as Yanukovych and Putin. Spent a lot of time and effort and resources trying to elect Yanukovych when he failed. in 2004, 2005, and also when he succeeded. It's using economic incentives, it's using economic pressure and threat. We have a pretty good understanding of why Yanukovych reneged on the association agreement with the European Union and instead opted for Eurasian Economic Union, which triggered the Euromaidan. It was a combination of both economic threats, personal threats, political threats, essentially a blockade on the border between Russia and Ukraine, where trucks were stopped for weeks. So, and no shots were fired, but there was still an entire government campaign of finding of political technologists, quote unquote, in other words, spin doctors, going to Ukraine and working on public opinion to get all those people elected, presenting pro-democratic Ukrainian politicians who are pretty liberal and absolutely non-nationalist, not nationalist and not xenophobic, like Yushchenko as being some crazy banderites. And again, and all those are non-military means targeted precisely to prevent Ukraine from going into both pro-democratic and pro-Western direction, because in Putin's mind, those are one and the same.
I think we have time for one last question.
Yes, then I'm going to be rude and say I have two questions, but they are quite linked, and I think you already answered the first one. I just wanted to present my question. It is about who's the enemy of Kremlin. In the early history, it might have been the Catholic Poles or the Austrian monarchs that are like foreigners corrupting the Russian Ukrainians. Is it now the Western gay democracy, or is there some sort of enemy for the Russian identity that needs to be purged? And the second question is related. When you mentioned how the liberals of Yeltsin failed in constructing a credible new identity for the Russian people, what's the current situation on this? Is it still the dominance of the conservative movement, or is there a liberal identity? Thank you.
Okay, so who is the enemy? Well, the enemy is whoever they don't like and whoever they feel threatened by. It's typically the West, but the definition of West is extremely expansive. It can be Poles, it can be the Catholics, it can be the Anglo-Saxons. They're absolutely obsessed with the Anglo-Saxons, even though no one in the West thinks about those terms, including the Anglo-Saxons. But that's what they really care about. But it's mostly looking westward and being threatened from the West, because that's historically where most of invasions of Russia come from. In terms of the identity, yes, this conservative neo-imperial identity is now fully ingrained, in part because the state works very hard to make it the state identity through curriculum, through textbook, through official propaganda, through cultural production. There are simply no other alternatives. And unfortunately, the opposition itself is trying to shy away from discussions of identity, because they know that those issues are not very popular among the Russians, and because they also know quite well that coming to the Russian people and saying that actually Crimea is Ukraine and those people are different will not be perceived very popularly, and they're thinking tactically about their potential electorate. But the Russian opposition right now is quite meaningless. They're not impacting. They're not having any impact. But if they do want to build a different Russia, then that's certainly an issue they will have to deal with. You can't fix Russia just by introducing elections or fixing the economy. If you want to have a peaceful Russia, then you need to address all those issues. The current government is not going to do it, and the liberals and the opposition are irrelevant. So, if it will happen, it will take a lot of time.
Thank you very much, Professor Finkel. And
thanks for coming. And there are books over there I will be more than happy to sign. Thank you. Thank you.